Good evening and welcome to the second video of Is Christmas Unbelievable by Rebecca McLaughlin. I'm hoping to release this on the 8th of December, the second Sunday of Advent, but I'm reading it the Tuesday night, the 3rd. So I don't have to read it the night before, on the same day, and then get it uploaded to YouTube. So, chapter 2 is, can we take the Gospels seriously? In Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince, Professor Dumbledore summons Harry to a series of lessons in his office. Dumbledore has been gathering evidence about the life of the evil Lord Voldemort. He's extracted memories from various sources, ranging from house elves to his own brain. And with the help of his magical pensieve, Dumbledore invites Harry to plunge into other people's pasts. One memory is from 60 years ago. 2 have been drawn from people shortly before they died. 1 has been tampered with, so Dumbledore sends Harry to retrieve the true original. The details of Voldemort's life, his parentage, his words, his deeds, even the prophecies concerning him, are all vital information. At the beginning of his gospel, Luke tells us how he got his intel about Jesus. Like Dumbledore, he's gathered information from those who from the beginning were eyewitnesses. That's verse 2 of Luke 1. John's gospel, the last to be written down, makes a yet bolder claim, that it is Jesus' disciple John's own eyewitness testimony in John 21 verse 24. But could this really be true? Weren't the Gospels written much too long after the events they describe to be believable? Can we take them seriously as sources on Jesus' birth, life and death? Well, we get the sub-question, are the Gospels like the telephone game? According to the famous atheist Richard Dawkins, everything that is in the Gospels suffered from decades of word-of-mouth retelling, Chinese whispery distortion, and exaggeration before those 4 texts were finally written down. That's from his book Outgrowing God, A Beginner's Guide, published by Random House 2019. I didn't do this with look at the what they were in the last one, but that needed quoting. Growing up in England, the author sometimes played a game known as Chinese whispers. As so often is the case with racist expressions, I didn't realise at the time that there were racist overtones to this term. Thankfully, in America, where the author now lives, it's known as the telephone game. A bunch of kids sit in a circle. The first child whispers a message to their neighbour, who whispers it to the next child, and so on. The last kid says out loud the message they heard, and everyone laughs at how much it has changed. Both Richard Dawkins and Bart Ehrman use this game as an analogy for how the Gospels came to be. So, is this a fair comparison? Most scholars think that Mark's Gospel was the first to be written, about 35 to 45 years after Jesus' death. Before that time, the stories about Jesus were passed on by word of mouth, but unlike in the telephone game, they were not whispered along a single chain. They were proclaimed in synagogues and marketplaces and from house to house. And rather than depending on a single source, like the first child, there were thousands of witnesses to Jesus' preaching and miracles. Large crowds gathered to hear him teach, and a smaller band of disciples travelled with him for several years. 12 of these disciples, known as apostles, were specially chosen to pass on what Jesus taught. Like the child who starts the telephone game, they knew firsthand what Jesus said and did. If there was ever any doubt as the message spread, they could be consulted. In his groundbreaking book, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, world-class New Testament scholar Richard Bauckham argues that the Gospels were written down when they were because the original eyewitnesses were starting to die out. Bauckham shows that specific people are named in the Gospels to flag them as eyewitnesses, as eyewitness sources. It was a way of saying, if you don't believe me, ask Mary Magdalene. She saw it with her own eyes. In the case of John's Gospel, Bauckham argues that it was indeed written by John himself. If this is true, John's Gospel isn't like the moment in the telephone game when the last child says what they think they heard. It's like the moment when the first child reports what the original message actually was. But could people really remember what they'd seen and heard from Jesus 35, 40, or even 60 years later? The next sub-question, wasn't the time lag just too long? The author's older brother was born on Christmas Eve. The author's mum remembers the details of his birth. She also remembers how unimpressed she was when my dad hired a flute trio to play her music when she brought the baby home. The author's dad meant well, but believe me, if your wife has just given birth, she doesn't want to listen politely to 3 strangers in her living room. This all happened a little over 40 years ago, about the same time difference as the one between Jesus' public ministry and when the first Gospel, Mark, was written down. A generation earlier, the author's grandparents tell the story of when my grandma went into labour with my mum. It was a cold winter's day and my grandpa had decided to make gingerbread. Rather than making a whole tray as he usually did, he used a muffin pan, but he didn't realise that smaller gingerbreads would cook much faster. When he got them out of the oven, they were so overcooked they were like rocks, and I've had a similar experience. So he threw one at the wall, and my grandma laughed so hard she went into labour. This was over 60 years ago, around the same time difference as that between Jesus' death and when the last Gospel, John, was written. And both my grandparents remember the day. The author's grandparents. When you think about it, the idea that people cannot possibly remember the important things that happened 35 plus years ago does not make sense. If you are over 40, you probably remember significant events from your childhood. If you're over 50, you'll certainly remember things from your teenage years. We don't remember everything we witnessed years ago, but we retain a highlights reel of important conversations and events. Meeting Jesus was utterly life-changing. 40, 50 or even 60 years would hardly have erased the memories. And in addition to the thousands who encountered him at various times, Jesus' disciples were trained to remember his words. Just as actors today commit vast swathes of a script to memory, so first-century disciples would learn their rabbi's teaching. It was their job. And in the time between Jesus' death and when the Gospels were written, Jesus' followers had taken every chance they had to share his message. Like actors staging the same play on world tour, they travelled around rehearsing their master's script. But how do we know they weren't exaggerating? The next sub-question, weren't the stories about Jesus exaggerated over time? Earlier in the Harry Potter series, Harry's friends Ron and Hermione were both held hostage by merpeople at the bottom of a lake. Afterwards, everyone was eager to hear their tale. At first, Ron's story matched Hermione's. But Harry noticed that Ron's version of events changed subtly with every retelling. 1 week after the event, Ron was telling a thrilling tale of kidnap in which he struggled single-handedly against 50 heavily armed merpeople who had to beat him into submission before tying him up. Richard Dawkins presents the Gospels as the result of a process like Ron's retellings, with multiple people over many years engaging in distortion and exaggeration. He imagines early recruits to the young religion of Christianity being eager to pass on stories and rumours about Jesus without checking them for truth. That's from his book Outgrowing God, as is the next quote. A miracle here, a virgin birth there, and so as the years go by, a charismatic preacher becomes divine in people's minds. But there are multiple problems with this hypothesis. First, Jesus' most amazing miracle was his resurrection from the dead. If Dawkins' thesis is correct, we'd expect that claim to come in the later writings, like Ron's increasingly fantastical tales. But the resurrection is a major theme in the earliest known writings about Jesus, some of the Apostle Paul's letters. What's more, if the resurrection claim had been made up by a Ron-like disciple, exaggerating for effect, there were plenty of Hermiones around to correct him. But the Gospels didn't depend on one person's testimony. Instead, many people claimed to have seen the risen Jesus. Second, saying that early recruits to Christianity made up the resurrection is like saying that early Facebook users made up social media. Without the resurrection claim, there would have been no young religion with eager new recruits. The Christian message is that God sent his Son to be born as a human, to die for our sins and to be raised to life, so that anyone who trusts in Jesus can live with him forever. The resurrection is the engine that drives this message, not an optional extra for the luxury model. Without it, there would have been no Christian movement poised to change the world. Jesus would have been just another failed Messiah. Third, while Ron's exaggeration of his hostage story made him more popular, the claim that Jesus rose from the dead and is now the rightful Lord of all got many of the early Christians killed. As we saw in the last chapter, Jesus' own brother James was willing to be stoned to death for proclaiming that Jesus was the resurrected king. Clearly, James did not make this claim for the sake of his own reputation. Fourth, as Dawkins himself notes, the idea that Jesus was God's promised king would have seemed pretty bonkers to first-century Jews. There were plenty of freedom fighters trying to raise an army against Roman rule, and they tended to end the same way, executed on Rome's bloodiest instrument of torture. Death on a cross spelled either the end of the movement or the transfer of leadership to another candidate. Claiming that Jesus had risen from the dead and that people should continue to follow him was outrageous. Simply put, you wouldn't make this stuff up. Which leads us to another point. Rather than making the first Christians look good, and unlike Ron's story about his heroic defeat of the merpeople, the Gospels are truly terrible PR. Which leads us to a subheading. The Gospels are really, really embarrassing. Close your eyes and think of your most shameful moment. Let's do a deal. I won't tell you mine, and you don't have to tell me yours. Now imagine that your moment of utter shame was written up in all 4 of the best-selling books of all time. That's what happened to the Apostle Peter. Peter was one of Jesus' closest friends. Mark's Gospel is thought to be based on his memories. If I were Peter, I'd have made sure that the write-up of my time with Jesus made me look great, but rather than airbrushing out his failures. Mark records Peter insisting to Jesus that he would never leave him in Mark 14 verse 29, and then that same night denying 3 times that he even knew Jesus in Mark 14, 66 to 72. The other Gospels report this incident too. Ron exaggerated his story to make himself look like a hero. Peter told the story of his most cowardly moral failure. He was a major leader in the early church. The only reason he let this tale be told is if it was true. And this is not the only way in which the Gospels were embarrassing. As we saw earlier, the resurrection of Jesus is the engine driving Christianity. If I was concocting a story, I'd try to make it sound as convincing as possible. But in all 4 Gospels, the first witnesses of Jesus' resurrection were women. In first-century Jewish culture, if you had wanted a story to be believable, the last thing you'd have done was point to the testimony of women, which wouldn't have been accepted in court in them days. Even the apostles were sceptical. When the women told them about the empty tomb, Luke writes in Luke 24 verse 10 and 11, "Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and the other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them." This is another deeply embarrassing moment for the early Christian leaders, but the first readers of the Gospels might have had some sympathy. An outlandish tale told by a bunch of women was easily discredited. So why did all 4 Gospel writers present the women as the first witnesses? It only makes sense if it's what actually happened. In fact, Balcom argues that these women are named by Luke because they were his eyewitness sources. Which proposes another question. What about the differences between the Gospels? I hope that by now you're curious enough to try reading the Gospels for yourself. I highly recommend that you do. They're the best-selling books of all time. And you could read the longest one, Luke, in the time it takes to watch a Harry Potter film. But if you read them back to back, you'll notice differences. Some stories appear in all 4 Gospels, others don't. For example, only Matthew and Luke tell the story of Jesus' birth. Sometimes a story Jesus told appears in one place in one Gospel and in another place with somewhat different words in another. Sometimes different Gospels record the same events in a different order. Put all these things together and you might think that it proves we can't trust the Gospels, whether that's in what they say about Christmas or about the rest of Jesus' life. So let's look at each of these kinds of differences in turn. First, none of the Gospels claim to be exhaustive. John's Gospel ends in chapter 21 verse 25. Now there are also many other things that Jesus did. Were every one of them to be written, I suppose that the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. You might think that Jesus' miraculous birth was a detail that John wouldn't want to leave out. But we'll look at the beginning of John's Gospel in chapter 4, and you'll see he chose another way out to tell us that Jesus is God's Son. The 4 Gospels together function like a string quartet. One instrument alone can be hauntingly beautiful, but the combined effect of several instruments is yet more stunning, as each brings different treatments of the same themes into harmony. Second, the fact that the Gospels sometimes record different sayings of Jesus in different places with different twists might at first sound fishy, but it's not. In the last few years, I've given dozens of talks in a host of different places. That's the author. I often repeat material, but I mix things up for new audiences. This is standard practice for preachers, politicians and performers even today. How much more so at a time when there was no mass media? What about the different ordering in one gospel versus another? It's hard to see how the order in which Jesus did things could legitimately be different in different accounts. Surely that must be a mistake. But if we think about it, we are used to storytellers not always moving chronologically. The author's husband, Brian, and I recently watched the murder mystery series Broadchurch. As the plot unfurled, there were multiple flashbacks. Brian is a clever guy with a PhD in engineering, but sometimes about the precision of his brain means that flashbacks don't compute. I've learnt just to tell him when one is starting. Why do filmmakers use flashbacks? Only to upset the engineers? No. They're inviting us to draw connections between what happened then and what is happening now. They do this in biopics too. The author recently watched a film called Hillbilly Elegy, which is based on the memoir of a man called J.D. Vance, who is now in his 30s. It frequently wove back and forward in time. Sometimes the gospel writers do the same thing. They order the events they record in a particular way, inviting us to make connections between the various episodes. Just as all of us, except the author's husband, are used to navigating flashbacks in films, so the first gospel readers would not necessarily have expected a chronological ordering, even for a historical account. Okay, you might say, so maybe the gospel accounts of Jesus' life would pass for historical documents, if only they were recounting realistic events. But the life of Jesus that they portray is as full of would-be magic as the life of Voldemort as seen through Dumbledore's pensieve. You're right. Rather than going around killing people, Jesus went around healing them. Rather than using the deaths of others to grasp at immortality, Jesus willingly endured death himself to give eternal life to anyone who would believe in him. John 3:16. But from Jesus' miraculous conception at the beginning to his resurrection at the end, his life story is full of unbelievable events. Can rational, educated 21st century people be expected to believe in supernatural stories like a virgin birth? Which we will cover in the next video. Question 3. How can you believe in a virgin birth?